She came to Wyoming with $40, a cast iron skillet, and a husband who couldn't look her in the eye. What she found waiting for her wasn't a fresh start. It was a ranch so far gone that even the crows had stopped circling. Everyone in Clearwater County said Marigold Quinn would be back on the eastbound train within a week. Everyone was wrong. This is the story of a woman who walked into the wreckage of a stranger's life and decided, against every reasonable instinct, that she would not walk away. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train had been running 4 hours late out of Cheyenne, which meant Marigold Quinn arrived at Clearwater Station just as the last of the daylight was giving up and going home. She stepped off the platform with a canvas traveling bag over one shoulder, a cast iron skillet wrapped in her mother's old quilt tucked under her arm, and $42 folded into the inside pocket of her coat. She'd counted the money twice on the train. She counted it again standing on the platform because $42 felt like both a lot and nothing at all when you were about to meet the man you'd agreed to marry. The station was smaller than she'd imagined. One building, 2 benches, a water trough that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. A boy of maybe 12 was leaning against the wall picking at a loose board, and he stared at her the way kids stare at something they've never seen before and aren't sure they want to. "Excuse me," Marigold said. "I'm looking for Rhett Calloway. Do you know him?" The boy squinted. "You the mail-order bride?" She kept her expression neutral. "I'm Marigold Quinn. Mr. Calloway wrote to me. I'm supposed to meet him here." The boy looked her over in that unsubtle way children have, taking in the traveling bag, the skillet, the dress that was practical rather than pretty. Then he pointed toward the far end of the road without saying another word and went back to picking at the board. Marigold turned. There was a man standing next to a wagon about 30 yards away. He had his back to her, one hand resting on the wagon's side rail, and he was looking out toward the flat open land to the west like something out there required his complete and undivided attention. She walked over. "Mr. Calloway?" He turned. He was taller than she'd expected from the photograph. The photograph had made him look compact and contained, but in person, Rhett Calloway was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered past its years. He had dark hair gone gray at the temples and eyes that were a complicated shade of brown, the kind of eyes that had seen things they'd rather forget. "Miss Quinn," he said. "That's me." She shifted the skillet under her arm. "It's good to meet you finally." He nodded. That was it, just a nod. He took her traveling bag without asking and put it in the wagon bed, then climbed up to the seat and waited. No hand offered to help her up, no comment about the journey or the delay or the weather. Nothing. Marigold climbed up herself and settled in next to him with the skillet on her lap. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved. They drove for 40 minutes without exchanging a single word. She tried twice. She asked about the ranch. How many acres? What kind of cattle operation? He answered in the fewest possible syllables. She asked about the town, whether Clearwater had a general store, a doctor, a post office. Same thing, short answers. Not rude, exactly, but not interested either. Like a man who'd already decided the conversation wasn't going to be worth the effort. After a while, she stopped trying and just looked at the land. Wyoming at dusk was something she wasn't prepared for. Back in Ohio, the landscape folded into itself. Gentle hills, farmland, streams running through stands of oak and maple. Here everything was enormous and exposed. The sky went on so far it looked like a mistake. The grass was pale gold in the failing light, and the mountains to the west were piled up against the darkening sky like something a child had stacked carelessly and never moved. It was beautiful in the way that certain difficult things are beautiful. Not comfortable, not welcoming, just true. The ranch appeared out of the dark with no warning. One moment there was nothing but open land, and then a structure emerged from the shadows, and Marigold realized it was a fence, except half of it had fallen down, and nobody had gotten around to putting it back up. Then a barn came into view, big enough once, now listing slightly to one side with boards missing along the upper wall. Then the main house. She didn't say anything, she just took it in. The house was 2 stories, wood frame, and it had been painted white once upon a time. Now the paint was peeling in long strips, and the porch railing on the left side had collapsed entirely and was just lying there on the ground in pieces like it had given up. One of the windows on the second floor had a crack running corner to corner, held together with a strip of cloth from the inside. Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He got her bag from the back. "Kitchen's through there," he said, gesturing toward the side of the house. "You'll want to see it." "All right," Marigold said. Inside was not better. The kitchen was large, she'd give it that. But the stove needed blacking. One of the burner plates had a crack through it, and the work table was unsteady on its legs. The larder had flour, some dried beans, a half-eaten side of salt pork, and 2 jars of something she couldn't identify. There was a smell in the room that she associated with spaces where cooking had become a chore nobody wanted to do. She set her skillet down on the stove and looked at it. "How many men work the ranch?" she asked. "7," Rhett said from the doorway. "And they eat here?" "They eat where there's food." He paused. "Lately, there hasn't been much." She turned to look at him. In the lamplight, his face was harder to read than it had been outside, which was saying something. But there was something behind the blankness. Not cruelty, nothing like that. More like a man who'd gotten so tired of treading water that he'd just stopped treading. "I'll need to take stock of what's here," she said, "and I'll need to know what the budget is for provisions." Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment exactly, something worse. "The budget is... it's limited, right now." "How limited?" Another pause. "Come talk to me in the morning. I'll show you the books." She almost pushed. She'd come all the way from Ohio. She'd ridden 40 minutes in silence next to a man who'd barely acknowledged her existence. And now he was offering her the books in the morning like she was a new employee being given an orientation. But she looked at his face and decided that whatever was behind those eyes was something that needed time and not pressure. "All right," she said. "Where do I sleep?" He showed her upstairs. The room was small and the mattress on the bed was old enough to have opinions, and the window had a draft coming through the gap around the frame that she could feel from 3 feet away. There was a washstand with a pitcher that had a chip in the rim. "It's not much," Rhett said. "It's fine," Marigold said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She had the distinct sense that he wanted to say something else. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation. But whatever it was, it didn't come out. He just nodded again in that closed-off way of his and told her breakfast was whenever she made it. And then his boots went down the hallway and down the stairs. And that was that. She sat down on the edge of the mattress. She'd written to 4 men through the matrimonial correspondence service. 2 hadn't written back. 1 had written back, but his letters were so full of himself that she'd stopped responding after the 3rd one. Rhett Calloway's letters had been brief and honest in a way that the others weren't. "The ranch needs work," he'd written in the 2nd letter. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I need someone who can handle hard circumstances. I am not an easy man." I don't know how else to say that without it sounding worse than I mean it. She'd appreciated that, preferred it to the men who promised things. But standing on the platform in Ohio with her bag and her skillet and her $42 reading the words, "I am not an easy man," was different from sitting in the actual room in the actual darkness and understanding what they meant. She didn't cry. That wasn't her nature. She unpacked what she needed from the bag, hung her coat on the hook behind the door, and lay down on the mattress with its opinions. Through the window, the Wyoming stars were ridiculous. More of them than she'd ever seen, so thick they seemed crowded. And she stared at them until the cold drove her under the blanket, and then she slept. Morning came gray and cold with a wind off the mountains that had ice in it even in May. Marigold was up before sunrise. She went down to the kitchen and spent 30 minutes understanding what she was working with. The cracked burner plate could be managed if she positioned things carefully. The stove needed blacking, but it still drew heat. The flour was good, the beans were dry and needed sorting, and the unidentified jar turned out to be apple butter, slightly sugared over at the top but fine underneath. She made biscuits, 2 dozen in 2 batches, because the oven was unreliable and she wanted to know where the hot spots were before she needed to count on it. She made salt pork sliced thin and fried until the fat rendered down to something worth eating. She made coffee. Real coffee, none of that chicory business. From a tin she found pushed to the back of the larder shelf. By the time the ranch hands started filtering in from wherever they'd been sleeping, there was food on the table. They came in cautious, the way people come into a room when they don't know what to expect. 7 men, ranging from a kid who couldn't have been more than 17 to an older Mexican man with a white mustache and the careful walk of someone whose knees hurt. They looked at the biscuits. They looked at the pork. They looked at Marigold. "You the new missus?" the youngest one said. "Marigold Quinn," she said. "Sit down and eat before it gets cold." That got them moving. They ate in a silence that was different from Rhett's silence the night before. This was the silence of people who were hungry and hadn't expected anything worth eating. She watched them from the corner of her eye as she cut more biscuits and got them into the oven. The older man, she'd learned later his name was Domingo, ate 3 biscuits and did not speak but nodded in her direction in a way that carried something real. Rhett came in last. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table full of men eating and then looked at her. "You were up early," he said. "There was work to do." She poured him coffee. He sat down at the end of the table and ate. He didn't say it was good, but she noticed he ate 2 biscuits and a full portion of pork and went back for a 3rd biscuit when he thought nobody was paying attention. After the men drifted out, Rhett stayed. He set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment, and she busied herself at the work table so he didn't feel watched. "I'll show you the books now if you want," he said. "I want." He spread them out on the kitchen table while she dried her hands. She pulled a chair over and sat close enough to read. The books were not good. Even without being an expert in ranch finances, Marigold could follow the story they told. 4 years ago, Callaway Ranch had been solvent. Modestly, barely, but in the black. Then there was a winter that killed 30% of the herd. Then a fence dispute with a neighboring property that had cost legal fees. Then another bad season. Then another. Now the ranch owed 2 local suppliers and was behind on a banknote out of Cheyenne. The cattle operation was running at maybe 40% of what it needed to break even. The hired men were working for reduced wages. She saw that in the ledger too, the entries that showed what they'd been paid and the notes in pencil beside some of them that said deferred. She turned a page, went back, turned again. "When is the banknote due?" she asked. "September." She did the math in her head. "And the cattle? You'd need to sell at what price per head to cover it?" He named a number. She looked at the cattle log, the count of what they had, what condition they were in, what prices the market had been running. "You can't do it," she said, not with cruelty, just stating it. "I know. So what happens in September if you can't cover the note?" He didn't answer, but she saw it in his face. He'd already thought through exactly what happened. She sat back. Outside the window, the yard was coming into the morning light, and she could see it clearly for the first time. The broken fence, the barn's bad angle, a wagon sitting in the yard with a wheel off that had probably been sitting there for weeks. A bunkhouse beyond that needed at least 2 new boards on the south-facing wall. Everything she looked at needed something. She'd known this was a struggling operation. He'd told her that in his letters. But there was a distance between knowing something in Ohio and seeing it here in Wyoming in the morning light with the account books open on the table in front of you. "I need to walk the property," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to know what I'm looking at." She pushed back from the table. "Will you show me?" They walked for 2 hours. It was not a comfortable walk. The wind was still cold and the ground was uneven, and Rhett wasn't a natural tour guide. But she asked questions, and he answered them, and gradually she understood the shape of the problem. The ranch was 640 acres. Originally it had run cattle on most of it. Now, between the herd losses and the reduced crew, they were working maybe a third of that. The east pasture fencing was bad enough that they couldn't run cattle there safely. The barn roof needed work before winter, or they'd lose whatever they stored there. The bunkhouse was livable, but only barely. What was still good? The land itself. The soil in the south meadow, the creek that ran along the eastern property line, reliable water even in dry years. And the location. That was what stopped her. They were standing on a slight rise looking south, and she could see it plainly. A long, flat scar across the landscape, earth turned up in a line running east to west as far as she could see in both directions. Fresh work. A lot of it. "What is that?" she asked. Rhett followed her gaze. "Railroad survey." "They're building?" "Building." He said it without inflection. "Started the survey last fall. Construction started up 3 weeks ago. They're running a line through to connect to the main line at, He named a junction she didn't know. "Big project. Couple years of work, maybe more." Marigold stood there looking at that scar in the earth and did the arithmetic in her head. A railroad construction project. running east to west across the southern edge of his property, close enough that she could see the work from here. A crew like that would need feeding, not just the workers themselves, but the overseers, the surveyors, the campmen. She thought about how many men it took to lay rail, to move earth, to drive spikes. Hundreds. Maybe more. How far is that from the ranch's south line? She asked. Maybe 2 miles. 2 miles. She turned around and looked back at the ranch house, at the kitchen with its cracked burner plate and unreliable oven. She looked at the barn. She looked at the creek. She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she was counting, estimating, running numbers in her head the way she'd done all her life, the habit her mother had called too much thinking, and her father had called the only useful thing about you, and either way, it had become the way she approached every problem. "Come on," Rhett said. "There's more to see." She followed him, but she kept looking back at that line of turned earth until it was out of sight. Whoa! That evening, she sat in the kitchen with a piece of paper and a pencil and worked. The men had eaten again, she'd made bean soup and cornbread, and there was not a lot of it, but there was enough, and the kid who was 17 had called it the best cornbread he'd ever had, which she suspected was either genuine or a lie of the most transparent kind, but either way, she'd been glad to hear it. Now the house was quiet, and she had the lamp turned up, and she was doing math. Railroad construction crew. She'd done some reading on this back in Ohio, before she'd ever thought about coming west. Her cousin's husband had worked a rail line in Pennsylvania, and she'd listened to enough of his talk over Sunday dinners to have a rough picture. A crew doing major grade work could run 300 to 500 men. They'd have their own supply operation. That was standard. But supply operations had gaps. They were running logistics over rough terrain. They weren't focused on feeding people well, just feeding them enough. She wrote down numbers, estimates, what it would cost to make a meal for 100 men, what you might charge, what the margin looked like if you were smart about supplies, what equipment you'd need beyond what was already in this kitchen. The numbers were rough and she knew it, but they pointed somewhere. She was still writing when she heard boots on the stairs and then on the kitchen floor, and Rhett was there in the doorway in his socks, which was such a surprisingly human detail that it almost made her laugh. "What are you doing?" he asked. She turned the paper so he could see it from where he stood. "Working something out." He came closer. He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a long moment. "You thinking about the railroad camp?" he said. "Not a question. I'm thinking about what a railroad camp needs that they probably don't have." He looked at her. Then he looked at the numbers again. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Tell me," he said. It was the most he'd said to her since she'd arrived, and she heard something different in it. Not warmth, not yet, but attention. He was actually listening, so she told him. She laid it out the way she'd been building it in her head. The gap in the supply operation, the men who needed feeding, the kitchen that could be scaled if they had the equipment, the wagon that could be made mobile if the wheel was fixed, the south meadow that could grow a kitchen garden for fresh supply. "You'd need more hands," he said when she finished. "You can't run a camp kitchen by yourself." "No, but you have men here who aren't fully employed right now. You said so yourself. Domingo. He worked in a restaurant kitchen, didn't he? I saw his hands this morning. That's how a man uses a knife when he's done it a long time." Rhett was quiet again. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. His face was still that locked-up thing it had been since the station. But he wasn't dismissing it. He was turning it over. "The railroad camp manager's name is Aldrich," he said finally. "Curtis Aldrich. He's out of Cheyenne. He's—" A pause. "He's not an easy man to deal with." "Neither was my father," Marigold said, "and I kept his accounts for 6 years." A moment passed. Something moved in Rhett's face. It was brief, and she almost missed it. A shift, like ice cracking, though nothing broke open yet. "The bank note is due in September," he said. "I know. If we don't cover it—" "I know," she said again. "So we need to cover it." He looked at the numbers on the paper for another long moment. Then he looked up at her. "You came out here to be a rancher's wife," he said, and there was something careful in how he said it, like he was trying to locate the edges of a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted to have. "I came out here for a fresh start," Marigold said. "I'm not particular about what shape that takes." Rhett Calloway looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to make her breathe carefully. Then he nodded. "Get some sleep," he said. If you want to talk to Aldrich, I'll take you out to the camp day after tomorrow. He does his inventory meetings on Thursdays." He got up. She watched him pad back toward the hallway in his socks. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He stopped, turned. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me the property today." He held her gaze for just a second. Then he went back upstairs. She turned down the lamp and sat in the dark kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the wind off the mountains and the creak of the house settling. Somewhere out on the property, an owl was talking to the dark. She picked up her pencil and added 3 more lines to the paper. The next morning, she made breakfast again. Eggs this time. She'd found a dozen hens in a coop behind the barn that nobody had mentioned, and more biscuits and the coffee that seemed to be the thing the men looked forward to most. While they ate, she talked to Domingo. His full name was Domingo Reyes, and he'd worked this ranch for 11 years. He'd seen the good years and the bad years. He was not a man who smiled easily, but there was a steadiness in him that she trusted on instinct. She asked him about the hens. He told her there'd been more once, 30 or 40, but the coop had fallen into disrepair and predators had gotten at them. He'd been keeping the 12 survivors going himself, paying for their feed out of his own wages. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. Seemed like something should keep going. She looked at him carefully. "I'm going to need help," she said. "If a project I'm thinking about comes together, I'm going to need someone who knows how to run a kitchen at scale. Not just cooking, I mean the organizing of it, the supply, the timing." Domingo looked at her. "You going to do something with the railroad camp?" It wasn't a question, and she noticed that. "You know about the camp? I can see it from the south pasture." He refilled his coffee. "I've been watching them work for 3 weeks. Big crew. Maybe 400 men. Their supply wagon is late half the time. I've seen men down there eating cold beans off tin plates for breakfast." He shook his head slightly. "Waste of men feeding them like that? A man who eats bad doesn't work like a man who eats good." "No," Marigold agreed. "He doesn't." They looked at each other. "What would you need from me?" Domingo said. "Honesty and work. A lot of work." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." She found out later from the youngest ranch hand, a boy named Tom who talked too much in the way that quiet places make people do, that Domingo had been thinking about leaving, that he'd been at the ranch long enough to see which way things were going and had been turning the question over for months. She found that out 3 weeks later, after things had begun to change. By then, Domingo had already decided to stay. She never mentioned it to him. Some things you don't need to say out loud. Eat. Thursday came and Rhett drove her south to the railroad camp. She'd spent the 2 days between preparing. She'd reworked her numbers 3 times, trying to tighten them and make them honest. She'd talked to Tom about the broken wagon wheel. Could it be fixed? How long would that take? What parts were needed? She'd inventoried the kitchen equipment properly, written down what was there and what was missing. She'd also done the thing she did when she was nervous, which was to stay very busy and not talk about it. The camp was bigger than she'd imagined. A city of tents stretched along the rail line, with the noise of metal on metal carrying across the flat ground from where the crews were actually working. She could see the line of men in the distance, tiny with distance, swinging hammers in a rhythm that looked almost choreographed until you got closer and saw how hard and irregular it actually was. The camp office was a large canvas structure with plank walls to chest height and a dirt floor. Curtis Aldrich met them there. He was a compact man of 50 or so, with a neat gray beard and the kind of eyes that were always doing calculations. He shook Rhett's hand and looked at Marigold the way men like him often looked at women in business settings. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the particular blankness of a man who simply hadn't arranged a category for her in his thinking yet. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "what can I do for you?" "Mrs. Quinn has a proposal for you," Rhett said. Aldrich looked at Marigold. "Mrs. Quinn." "Mr. Aldrich." She had her paper with her, the numbers she'd reworked 3 times, but she didn't pull it out yet. "I understand your supply operation has some reliability issues." A very slight pause. "Where'd you hear that?" "I watched your supply wagon run 3 days late last week from the Calloway property line, and I talked to your morning cook at the East Gate yesterday." She hadn't, that was a stretch, but she'd heard enough from Domingo about what the camp operation looked like, and she made the calculated decision that Aldrich would respect confident information more than admitted guesswork. Your men are losing productivity because they're not being fed properly. That's money you're leaving on the table. Aldrich looked at her. Then he looked at Rhett. Then he looked back at Marigold. And you're proposing to fix that how, exactly? He said. The tone was not quite skeptical, more like a man waiting to see if the next sentence was worth listening to. Marigold put her paper on his desk and turned it so he could read it. A catering contract, she said. Hot meals, 3 times a day, for your full crew. Delivered to the work site. Consistent quality. No late supply wagons. You get reliable feeding for your men, and I get a contract that's fair to both sides. She paused. I've done the math. I know what it costs you to lose half a day's productivity from an underfed crew. I know what I'm offering is cheaper than that cost. Aldrich looked at the paper. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't rush it. You're operating out of the Callaway kitchen, he said. To start. The operation can scale. To start, he repeated, and there was something skeptical in how he said it, but not dismissive. I'm not asking you to stake your operation on a promise, Marigold said. I'm asking for a 2-week trial. You pay for the food, I cover labor and equipment. At the end of 2 weeks, if your men aren't eating better and your productivity hasn't improved, you owe me nothing. If it has, we negotiate a full contract. Aldrich looked at Rhett. She always like this? I don't know yet, Rhett said. She's been here 4 days. Something happened at the corner of Aldrich's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. 2 weeks, he said. Let's see what you can do. Chet. She should have felt triumphant on the drive home. Part of her did. But the bigger part of her was already 3 steps ahead, running the list of everything that had to happen in the next 48 hours. The wagon wheel, the equipment gaps, the supply order, the conversation with Domingo about crew roles, the menu planning, You lied to him, Rhett said. About the East Gate cook. She looked at him. He was watching the road. I extrapolated, she said. You didn't talk to anyone at the East Gate. No, but I was right about what I said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the road. Then, yes, you were. She looked back at the road. Does that bother you? Another long pause. I don't know yet. He glanced at her sideways. You always like this? She recognized it. He was repeating what Aldrich had said, and there was something in the repetition that was almost dry humor, which was the last thing she'd expected from him. My father said I was relentless, she said. He didn't mean it as a compliment. He looked back at the road. Might be one, depending. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. The wind came off the mountains, and the light was going golden over the grass, and the broken fence of the Callaway property came into view, 1 post leaning, 2 rails down on the ground. She looked at the fence. She thought, that's the first thing we fix when there's money. The fence. Something has to stand up straight first. The wagon rolled through the gap where the gate should have been, and Callaway Ranch, broken and battered and not yet hers in any way she could name, came into the last of the evening light. She had 2 weeks to prove something. She intended to use all of them. The wagon wheel took 1 day to fix, not 2, because Tom turned out to be better with iron and wood than he let on, and because Marigold stood next to him while he worked and handed him things and asked questions until he understood that the timeline was not negotiable. By 6 o'clock that evening, the wheel was back on. By 7, she had the wagon inventoried, what it could carry, what the weight limits were, how the canvas cover was rigged, and whether it could be modified to keep heat in during transport. It could. Barely. But barely was enough to start. Domingo watched her crawl around the wagon bed with a measuring string and did not offer to help until she asked him to hold one end of the string against the far corner. Then he held it without comment. You ever run a large kitchen operation? She asked him from the other end of the wagon. Ran the kitchen at the Abilene Cattlemen's Hotel for 3 years, he said. Before I came here. She looked up at him. Why'd you leave? A pause. The owner's son took over. He had ideas. Bad ones? Expensive ones, which amounts to the same thing. He kept holding the string. What are you measuring for? I need to know if I can fit 2 full sheet pans and a Dutch oven in here with enough clearance to keep the heat from becoming a problem, and whether we can rig something to keep the coffee urn stable on rough ground. Domingo considered this with the careful attention of a man who had thought about logistics in kitchens for a long time. You'd want to build a frame, low center of gravity, bolt it to the bed here and here, he pointed. The urns go in there. They won't tip. Can you build that? Give me the wood in half a day. She wrote it on her list. The list was getting long. She went to bed that night with her head full of numbers and woke up the next morning the same way, which was how she'd lived most of her adult life, in which she'd long since stopped fighting. Her brain did what it did. You worked with what you had. The first week of this trial was brutal in the way that honest hard work is brutal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just long and physical and relentless. She was up 2 hours before the ranch hands and in bed 2 hours after. And in between, she was either cooking or planning or moving things from one place to another or having conversations that needed to be had. The menu she'd settled on was practical and not fancy. Salt pork and beans with cornbread in the mornings, a rotating stew at midday, bread and whatever protein she could source for the evening meal. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required equipment she didn't have. The goal was volume, consistency, and enough actual nutrition to keep 400 men functional. The first morning delivery, she drove the wagon herself, with Domingo beside her and Tom in the back watching the urns. The camp road was rough, rougher than she'd expected, and the Dutch oven slid 6 inches before Domingo's frame caught it, and the coffee in the lead urn sloshed enough to scald her wrist when she reached back to check it. She bit down on the pain and kept driving. The East Gate crew supervisor was a man named Decker, heavy-set, skeptical, with the look of someone who'd seen a lot of promises not keep themselves. He looked at the wagon. He looked at her wrapped wrist. He looked at the food. "This the trial run?" he said. "This is breakfast," Marigold said. "Where do you want it?" He pointed toward the open area at the near end of the work line. She pulled the wagon there, and she and Domingo and Tom set up in about 12 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than she'd planned for, but she didn't show that on her face. The men came for food the way men come when they've been eating badly, cautiously at first, then faster when the word went back down the line. She stood behind the serving board and ladled and handed and answered questions and watched their faces. Not all the faces showed anything, but enough of them did. By the end of the first week, Decker had stopped looking skeptical and started just looking tired, which she took as an improvement. By the end of the second week, he pulled her aside before the morning delivery and told her that Aldrich wanted a meeting. She went with her numbers updated and her terms already decided. Aldrich's canvas office was warmer this time. Someone had added a small iron stove in the corner. He had his own papers out when she arrived, and he didn't preamble. "My crew supervisor tells me productivity is up about 12% since you started," he said. "He also tells me there have been fewer fights at mealtime, which costs me as much as the productivity does." "Hungry men are irritable men," Marigold said. "That's not complicated." "No." He looked at her paper when she put it on his desk. He went through it line by line, and she watched him do it, and she could tell he was a man who understood numbers because he didn't rush and he didn't pretend. He went back to 2 lines and read them twice. "This margin," he said. "This is what you're making per head." "Yes." "That's thin." "It's fair," she said. "I'm not trying to get rich off you, Mr. Aldrich. I'm trying to build something that works for both of us long enough to matter." He looked at her for a moment. "What are you asking for in the full contract?" She told him. It was a 6-month agreement, renewable, at a per-head daily rate that gave her enough margin to cover equipment replacement and 1 additional hired hand. She'd worked the number until it was the lowest she could go and still make the operation viable. He made a counteroffer that was 8% lower. She countered back at 4% below her opening number. He looked at her. "You've done this before. I kept accounts for my father's hardware business from the time I was 16, she said. "I know what a fair deal looks like." He accepted the 4% concession, and they shook hands on a 6-month contract. She kept her expression steady through the handshake. She didn't let herself feel it until she was back in the wagon with Domingo and Tom, and the camp road was behind them. "Well?" Domingo said. 6 months, she said. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh. "Bueno." Tom, in the back, made a sound like he'd been holding his breath. "We got it? We actually got it?" "Don't celebrate yet," Marigold said. "We just got the permission to work harder than we've ever worked." But she was looking at the mountains, and there was something moving in her chest that she didn't quite have a word for. The contract changed things, but it didn't fix them. That was the thing people didn't understand about a solution. It just cleared the ground for the next problem, which had been there waiting all along. The kitchen at the ranch was not built for this volume. She knew that going in, and she'd planned around it as best she could. But planning around a problem and living with it day after day are two different experiences. The stove was reliable if you treated it carefully, but carefully meant monitoring it constantly. And she couldn't monitor a stove and manage delivery prep and handle the purchasing at the same time. She needed another body in the kitchen. She found that body through Domingo, who knew almost everyone in Clearwater County in the way that men who've worked one place for 11 years tend to know everyone. He mentioned a woman named Pearl Hatch, whose husband had gone east 6 months ago. Went to find work in Denver, was how people said it, though Domingo said it in a way that made clear he thought the actual story was more complicated, and who had 2 children and was taking in mending to get by. Can she cook? Marigold asked. She ran the church social for 3 years, Domingo said. Best pie crust in the county. I need someone who can scale quantities, not make pie crust. She can do both, he said. She's not stupid, she just doesn't have anywhere to use it. Marigold went to see Pearl Hatch that same afternoon. She rode into town on the mare she'd figured out belonged to the ranch. A gray quarter horse named something she couldn't pronounce, who turned out to have a smooth trot and very definite opinions about puddles. And found the house on the south end of Clearwater's main street. A small frame building that was tidy in the way that people keep things tidy when tidiness is one of the few things they can control. Pearl answered the door with one child on her hip and another visible through the open parlor door. She was maybe 30, with red hair going copper at the temples and a face that was composed in the way of someone who has gotten very practiced at not letting things show. Mrs. Calloway, she said, because word had gotten around that there was a new Mrs. Calloway, even if the actual details of her were still forming in the town's mind. Miss Quinn, actually, Marigold said. We haven't had the ceremony yet. She hadn't thought about that until the words came out of her mouth, and she noted the mild awkwardness of it, and moved past it. I'm looking for help with a kitchen operation. Domingo Reyes suggested your name. Pearl's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. The practiced composure cracked slightly at the edges in the way it does when someone says something unexpected and real. Come in, Pearl said. They talked for an hour. Marigold was direct about what the job was, what it paid, what the hours were. She didn't soften the hard parts. Pearl had 2 children and couldn't leave them unattended, which meant some of the early morning prep would need accommodation. Marigold thought through the timing while Pearl watched her do it. The first batch starts at 4:30, Marigold said. If your neighbor could watch them until 6, you could... Mrs. Greer next door is up at 4, Pearl said. She's got insomnia. She's told me a dozen times she doesn't mind company in the early hours. Marigold looked at her. Pearl looked back. When do I start? Pearl said. Monday, Marigold said. And bring your children on the first day so Domingo can meet them. He has a way with children, and I want them comfortable at the ranch in case there are mornings we need the flexibility. Pearl blinked. You've thought about this. I try to think about things before they become problems, Marigold said. It doesn't always work, but it's the approach. By the end of the first month, the operation had found a rhythm, which was not the same as running smoothly. Nothing ran smoothly, and she'd stopped expecting it to, but a rhythm. The deliveries went out at the right times. The quantities were right more often than they were wrong. Pearl turned out to be exactly what Domingo had said, not stupid, with nowhere to use it, and with a patience in the kitchen that Marigold, who was fast and impatient, found genuinely useful. The first money came in from Aldrich's camp at the end of the second week on the contract. Marigold sat at the kitchen table after everyone else was in bed and worked through the accounting. She paid Domingo what she owed him from the deferred wages. She paid Tom. She paid Pearl. She set aside the supply fund for the next 2 weeks and the equipment replacement fund and the debt service allocation. What was left was not a lot, but it was more than nothing, and it was pointing the right direction. She put the ledger back on its shelf and went to tell Rhett. He was in the small room off the main parlor that served as his office, sitting at his desk with the same ranch accounts she'd looked at on that first morning. He was doing the same thing she'd been doing, going through the numbers and trying to find the space between what was owed and what was coming in. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. First payment cleared, she said. Here's where the accounts stand. She put her own summary on his desk beside his papers. He looked at her summary and then at his papers and back again, and she watched him do the arithmetic in his head. You paid Domingo back wages, he said. He was owed it. I know he was owed it. He said it quietly, without defense. I just... He stopped. Thank you. She hadn't expected that. She also hadn't expected the way he said it. Not stiff or formal, but like it came from somewhere real. It's the ranch's money, she said. I just moved it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the papers. If this keeps on... He ran a finger down the column. 3 more months of this and we can cover the banknote. Maybe have something left over. That's what I'm working toward, she said. I know. He looked up again. You're good at this. She wasn't sure how to take that. She wasn't sure she was supposed to take it as anything in particular. So she just said, "Good night, Mr. Calloway," and went back to the kitchen to check that the morning prep was set up right. She'd started calling him Rhett about 2 weeks in, because Mr. Calloway was unwieldy in a kitchen context, and he'd never told her to use it. But something in that moment made her revert, and she wasn't sure why, and she didn't think about it too hard. The problem with things going better is that they attract attention. This was something she knew from her father's hardware business. The years when the business was struggling, nobody paid it much mind. The year it turned profitable, suddenly there were opinions about how it should be run. Competitors who hadn't thought about it in years started watching the pricing. The man 2 streets over who sold rope and some tools started stocking hardware. She should have expected the same pattern here. The first sign was a conversation at the general store in Clearwater. She'd gone in for a supply order, dried beans, flour, a case of salt, and the owner, a man named Hedges, who ran the place with his wife and a rotating cast of opinions about the town, asked her how the railroad contract was going. She said it was going well. He said that was good to hear. Then he mentioned that he'd heard from Garrett Bellows, who owned the largest spread in the county, east of town, 1,500 acres, and a cattle operation that was actually functional, that the railroad camp was using outside supplies rather than buying locally, and that some people thought that was a problem. Marigold looked at Hedges. "I buy from you," she said. "I know you do," he said quickly. "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" He rang up her order and didn't answer the question, which was itself an answer. She drove home thinking about Garrett Bellows, who she hadn't met but whose name she'd heard a few times in ways that told her something about his position in the county. He owned a lot of land. He'd been here a long time. And he apparently had something to say about her contract. She mentioned it to Rhett that evening. He was quiet for longer than usual. She was starting to understand his silences. There were different kinds. This one was the kind where he was deciding how much to say. "Bellows made a run at this property 2 years ago," he said finally. "When things got bad, he offered to buy the south 40 acres. I said no." "Why?"
Say,
"Because the south 40 is the best grazing land I have. Selling it would have kept us going another year, maybe. And then we'd have been exactly where we were before, but with less land and less options." She thought about that. He didn't like the answer. No. And now someone on his ranch is apparently talking to the railroad camp about us. Rhett's jaw tightened slightly. "Where'd you hear that?" "I didn't, specifically, but Hedges brought up Bellows in the context of outside supplies, and the way he said it made me think Bellows has been having conversations." Rhett looked at her. "You got all that from a conversation at the general store?" "People tell you things when they don't realize they're telling you things," she said. "My mother called it listening. My father called it suspicious. Either way, it's useful." He was quiet again. "Bellows has a kitchen operation on his own ranch," he said. "Nothing formal, but he's got cooks and equipment. If he wanted to pitch Aldrich on a catering arrangement, he could." "Could he undercut me?" "He's got more resources. He could absorb a lower margin longer." She turned this over. The fire in the kitchen stove was burning low, and she got up to add wood, more to give herself something to do while she thought than because it needed it urgently. "Does he know you and I—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to phrase the nature of their arrangement to Rhett himself, which was its own interesting problem. "Does he know about the contract?" "He knows. This county, everybody knows everything eventually." She added the wood. The fire caught. "All right," she said. "All right, what?" "All right, I'll think about it." She turned around. "Don't do anything. Don't say anything to anyone about Bellows or the contract or any of it. Let me think." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between wariness and a reluctant kind of trust. like a man who'd learned to be careful about hoping for things and was finding it difficult to stop. "You're not worried?" he said. "I'm worried," she said. "I'm just not panicking. Those are different." He looked at her for another moment. Then something pulled at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Still not quite that, but the precursor of one. Something that said, maybe. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got a 4:30 start." She went upstairs. She lay on the opinionated mattress in the drafty room and looked at the Wyoming stars through the window she'd stuffed a rag around to cut the draft, which helped maybe 20%. She was worried. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise to herself, even if she'd presented calm to Rhett. Bellows was a real threat. Not in the dramatic sense, not someone who would do something visible and confrontational, but in the slower and more dangerous way of a man with resources and patience and a long memory. She dealt with that kind before. She thought about it until the cold drove her under the blanket, and she thought about it a little longer after that, and somewhere in the thinking she found the shape of something. Not a complete answer, but a direction. The railroad contract had one vulnerability, and she knew what it was. Aldrich had signed with her because she'd delivered. But she was still one operation, still proving herself, still building. If something disrupted the delivery schedule, a bad supply week, an equipment failure, a sick crew, she couldn't cover it. Not yet. The way to protect herself from Bellows wasn't to fight him. It was to make the contract so valuable to Aldrich that replacing her would cost more than it was worth, which meant she needed to do something bolder than hot beans and cornbread. She stared at the ceiling and thought about what that might look like. And by the time she finally slept, she had the rough edges of an idea. And the rough edges of an idea were what she usually started with, and she'd learned to trust them even when they didn't look like much yet. Outside, the Wyoming wind came down from the mountains and pushed at the walls of the house, and the house held. It wasn't solid. It was still damaged in a dozen places. But it held. That was enough for now. The idea that had come to her in the dark, in those half-formed edges just before sleep, took 3 days to become something she could write down in a straight line. She'd been thinking about the contract's vulnerability. One operation, no backup, no room for a bad week. And the answer she kept arriving at was the same one she didn't want to face, because it required money she didn't have and commitment she couldn't fully guarantee. But every time she tried to route around it, she ended up back in the same place. She needed to expand the menu, not in a complicated direction. Not fancy. But right now she was feeding 400 men the same rotation of protein and starch and beans, and it was better than what they'd had before. But better than before was a low ceiling. If she could add something that felt like a small luxury, fresh bread instead of cornbread, a rotating soup that changed through the week, coffee that stayed hot longer because she'd figured out the insulation problem with the urns, she'd give Aldrich something that Bellows couldn't match just by undercutting her price. You couldn't underprice quality when the men doing the work were the ones noticing the difference. She explained this to Domingo on a Tuesday morning while they were prepping the midday batch. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a potato in his hands. "Fresh bread means an earlier start," he said. 4 o'clock, maybe earlier." "I know." "And the soup rotation means more ingredient variety, which means the supply order gets more complicated." "I know that too." He put the potato down. "What are you worried about?" She looked at him. "I'm worried Bellows is going to move on Aldrich before I get this stable enough that replacing me isn't worth the trouble." Domingo nodded slowly. "How long do you think you have?" "I don't know, weeks, maybe less." He picked up his knife and went back to the potato. "Then we start the bread tomorrow. I know the timing. I've done 4 a.m. before." Pearl, when she arrived an hour later and Marigold explained the change, pushed her red hair back from her face and said, "Mrs. Greer is going to think I've lost my mind." "Will she still watch the children?" "She'll watch them and feed them and probably teach them card games," Pearl said. "That woman doesn't sleep. I've always found it unnerving." She tied her apron. "What kind of bread?" "Whatever travels best and stays edible for 4 hours in the wagon." Pearl thought about it. "Dutch oven loaves, heavy crust. They hold heat and they don't go gummy." She paused. "My mother made them for harvest crews when I was small, 12 at a time." "Can you teach Domingo the timing?" "Probably faster than I can teach you," Pearl said, with a directness that was not unkind. Marigold took that without argument because it was true. She was fast and organized, but bread was not her strength. Bread required patience in a specific physical way that she hadn't developed, and Pearl had it. The bread went into the first delivery on Thursday. She watched the crew supervisor Decker when he lifted the cover on the first basket. He looked at the loaves. He pulled a piece off one and ate it. He didn't say anything, but he called over 2 men from the nearest work crew and pointed at the baskets. And they came and ate, and one of them said something to Decker that made Decker nod. She took that as sufficient. The response came back through the crew in the way responses travel through a community of working men. Not in words exactly, but in how fast the line moved, in the fact that the bread was gone before the stew, in the way the morning energy felt different. Men who eat well work differently than men who eat badly. She'd believed that in theory since she'd proposed it to Aldrich at their first meeting. Now she could see it in practice, and it was more pronounced than she'd expected. Aldrich sent a message through Decker 2 days later, asking if she could come to the office when she had time. She made time the following morning. He had coffee waiting, which was new, and he was less abrupt than he'd been in their previous meetings. She noticed the change in him and filed it away without commenting on it. "My men are talking about the bread," he said. "I heard. Productivity is up another 8% over last week." He set down his cup. "I want to extend the contract." She had expected this conversation. She'd been preparing for it, but she made herself settle in the chair and breathe normally and not show any of the alertness that had been running through her since Decker's message. "I'm listening," she said. He put a document on the desk. It was 2 pages, handwritten in a clear commercial hand, and she could see from where she sat that it was dense. She reached for it, and he let her take it. She read it the way her father had taught her to read contracts. Not for the obvious meaning, but for the structure. The way a document is put together tells you more than the words themselves, because words can be made to say almost anything, but structure reveals what the writer actually wants. The first page looked straightforward. Extended contract term, 18 months instead of 6. Locked in per head rate with a cost of supply adjustment clause. Delivery schedule, penalties for missed deliveries. Standard. The second page was where she slowed down. There was an exclusivity clause. She read it twice, then a third time, because the language was careful in the way that careful language is when someone wants to say something without being caught saying it. What it amounted to was this. For the duration of the 18-month contract, she could not enter into any other catering or food service arrangement with any other railroad, construction, or industrial operation within 50 miles of the current camp. 50 miles covered most of the county, most of the territory between Clearwater and the Cheyenne Junction. She kept her face still and read the rest of the page. There was a renewal clause. The contract would auto-renew for another 18 months unless she gave written notice 60 days prior to termination. And the notice had to be delivered in person to the railroad company's main office in Cheyenne. In person. In Cheyenne. She put the document down. "This exclusivity clause," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "Standard for extended contracts." "Is it?" "It protects the railroad's investment in the relationship. We're locking in a rate. We need to know you're not going to take that operational knowledge and build a competing service for another construction company." The explanation was reasonable on its surface. She turned it over anyway. "The 50-mile radius," she said. "That covers the Larimer County line." "More or less. There's a new mining operation starting up near Larimer in the fall. I've heard they'll need camp supply services." Aldrich's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A very slight stillness, the kind that comes over a man when a conversation has arrived somewhere he'd hoped it wouldn't. "As I said," he said. "Standard clause." She looked at the document again, then she looked at Aldrich. She thought about Bellows. She thought about the timing. She thought about the fact that Aldrich had moved to extend the contract precisely now, after the bread, after the productivity numbers, when she'd proven enough value that losing her would hurt, but before she'd become so established that she could afford to say no to a bad deal. Somebody had advised him to move now. She didn't know who, but the timing was not accidental. "I need a few days to review this," she said. "Of course," Aldrich said. "Take your time." He said it in the way people say things when they don't mean the words, but the subtext. The subtext being not too much time. She rode back to the ranch with the document in her bag and her mind already working. She spread the contract on the kitchen table that evening and went through it again, this time with a pencil and a separate piece of paper for notes. Rhett sat across from her. She'd asked him to be there, not because she needed him to understand the contract, she understood it, but because she wanted him to see what she was seeing. She walked him through it. The exclusivity clause, the auto-renewal, the notice requirement. He read the second page slowly. His expression didn't shift much, but she could see the moment he arrived at the same conclusion she had. "If you sign this," he said, "you can't bid on the Larimer mining operation. Not for 18 months, maybe 36 if I miss the notice window. And the mining operation, bigger than this camp," she said. "Longer timeline, more men." He was quiet. "So this contract is good for the railroad and bad for us." "The base terms are fair," she said. "The rate is right. The extended timeline helps with the banknote and beyond. But the exclusivity locks me out of the next opportunity at exactly the time I'd be positioned to take it." He leaned back in his chair. She could see him trying to locate the angles. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to counter. He won't like it." "He doesn't have to like it," she said. "He has to decide whether my counter is better or worse than his alternatives." She'd already thought through what his alternatives were. He could go to Bellows, but Bellows would take time to set up, would disrupt a crew that was currently performing, and would cost something in productivity and morale while the transition happened. He could hire a supply operation out of Cheyenne. She'd looked into what those operations ran, and they were more expensive than she was and less flexible. Or he could negotiate with her. The card she had was the one she'd been building for 2 months. She worked, the men responded to her work, and replacing her now would cost more than it looked. "What's your counter?" Rhett asked. She slid her draft across the table. She'd written it out after dinner while Pearl cleaned the kitchen, keeping one ear on Pearl's older child who was teaching the younger one a nonsense rhyme in the corner. Rhett read it. The counter was simple. She'd accept the extended term and the locked rate. She'd accept delivery penalties because she was confident she could meet the schedule. But she was striking the exclusivity clause entirely and replacing it with a narrower non-compete. She would not service any other operation that was in direct geographic competition with this camp, meaning within 10 miles. Beyond that, she was free to operate, and she was changing the renewal notice requirement from in-person in Cheyenne to written notice delivered to the camp office. "The renewal change," Rhett said. "He'll fight that." "The in-person Cheyenne requirement is designed to make it difficult for me to exit," she said. "I'm not signing anything that makes it structurally hard for me to leave a bad situation." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was more complex than what she usually saw there. "You learned that somewhere." "Yes," she said. She didn't say where. Some things didn't need to be explained. He slid the paper back across the table. "It's a good counter. He might walk." "He might," she said, "but I don't think he will. He likes certainty, and I'm the certain option right now." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then, "And if Bellows is the one who pushed him toward this contract?" "Then Bellows overplayed it," she said. "A trap that gets spotted stops being a trap." She said it simply, without heat, but she meant it. Whoever had advised Aldrich on the exclusivity clause, whether it was Bellows or the railroad company's own legal man, or just standard practice that happened to work in someone else's favor, had assumed she would sign without reading carefully, or read carefully and sign anyway because the base terms were good. That was the assumption about women in business situations that she'd been navigating since she was 16 years old. People assumed you were grateful enough for the opportunity to miss the small print. She was never that grateful. Bob. She brought the counter to Aldrich the following morning, early, before the delivery crew arrived. He read it at his desk while she stood. She hadn't sat down this time. She wasn't sure why. Instinct, mostly. Something about the conversation felt like it needed her to be standing. He got to the exclusivity section and stopped. She watched him read it twice. "You're striking the non-compete entirely," he said. "I'm replacing it with a narrower version that protects your actual interests. My actual interests include not having my supply operator build a competing service while she's under contract to me." "I'm not planning to compete with you," Marigold said. "I'm planning to grow. There's a difference. If I take on the Larimer mining operation in the fall, I'll have more capital, more equipment, and more experienced crew, which means I'll be better at servicing this contract, not worse." Aldrich looked at her. That's a convenient argument. It's also true, she said. And you know it. A pause. He looked at the counter again. The renewal notice, he said. You're removing the Cheyenne requirement. Written notice to the camp office is standard, she said. The Cheyenne requirement creates an unnecessary barrier. I'm not going to fight my way out of a contract. If I want out, I'll give you proper notice, and I'll honor the timeline. But I'm not signing something that makes the exit structurally difficult. Aldrich put the papers down. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Less calculated than his usual manner, more direct. You read contracts the way a lawyer reads contracts, he said. I read them the way anyone should, she said. Carefully. He was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. I'll accept the narrowed non-compete, he said finally. 10 miles instead of 50. And the notice change. He paused. But I want a clause that gives us right of first refusal if you take on outside contracts. Not exclusivity, just first refusal. She thought about that. First refusal was manageable. It meant he got to match any competing offer before she could accept it. It was a concession that felt significant, but cost her relatively little in practice. First refusal on contracts within the county, she said. Not beyond. He considered it. Agreed. They shook hands. This time she did feel it. A clean, clear thing, not triumphant exactly, but solid. The feeling of a line held. She was loading the empty delivery equipment back into the wagon when Decker came out from the east end of the camp and walked over, moving with the deliberate gait of a man who has something to say and is deciding how much of it to say. You heading out? He said. In a few minutes, Marigold said. She straightened up and looked at him. Decker had the kind of face that kept its opinions mostly internal, but she'd been watching him long enough now to read the edges. Something was bothering him. There was a man here yesterday, he said, while you were in with Aldrich. Came in from the west side, talked to a couple of the crew supervisors. I didn't get a name, but I know the ranch hands he was talking to. They're both bellows men who hired on here for the season. She looked at him. What were they talking about? Couldn't hear it all, but I heard your name. He paused. And I heard something about a supply delivery, payment. I don't know what it means. She didn't either, not precisely. But she thought about it on the drive home, and by the time the ranch came into view, she had a rough picture of what Bellows might be doing. If he couldn't underprice her directly, the next move was to undermine her reliability. Create a delivery problem. Pay someone inside the camp to interfere with an order, to short a payment, to report a quality issue that hadn't happened. Something small enough to look like incompetence on her part. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and sat for a moment before climbing down. She'd dealt with a version of this before, not on this scale, but in principle. Back in Ohio, when her father's hardware store had been the target of a competitor's whispering campaign. Their stock is inferior, their accounts are unreliable. The son-in-law drinks, small cuts, nothing provable. The damage accumulated. The way you fought it was not by defending yourself to everyone. You fought it by making the evidence against you harder to manufacture. You documented everything. You created a paper trail so thick and so clear that any false report could be compared against it and found wrong. She went inside and found Tom and told him she needed him to start logging every delivery. Not just the general record she already kept, but specific. The exact time, the weight of each item, the condition on arrival, the name of whoever received it, an account verified by both him and that person. Tom looked at her. That's a lot of paperwork. Yes, she said. Start tomorrow. He didn't argue. She had learned that about Tom. He had opinions, which he expressed freely, but he did what needed doing when the reason was clear. That evening, she also started keeping a separate cash ledger. Not the main accounts, those she kept carefully already, but a secondary record locked in the strongbox under her bed that documented every payment received and from whom and in what form. If someone was planning to interfere with a payment, substituting counterfeit coin, short paying and claiming otherwise, she wanted a record that was independent of the main ledger and could be cross-checked. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the new ledger open when Rhett came in late from the pasture, later than usual, with mud on his boots and a cut on his left hand he hadn't bothered to address. She looked at the hand. What happened? She said. Fence wire, he said. He was already moving toward the water basin. Let me see it. He stopped. turned his hand over with the air of a man who found this attention unnecessary. The cut was a clean slice across the palm, not deep enough to be dangerous, but long enough that it had bled more than it should have. She got the clean cloth from the shelf and the tin of salve and dealt with it without asking him to sit down, because she'd noticed he didn't like being managed. He stood still and let her work. "Decker told me something today," she said, while she wrapped the cloth. "About a man from Bellows talking to people in the camp." She felt his hand tense slightly under hers. "What kind of talking?" he said. "I don't know exactly, but I have a guess." She tied off the bandage. "I'm documenting everything now, every delivery, every payment. If someone tries to manufacture a reliability problem, I want a record they can't argue with." He looked at his wrapped hand. Then he looked at her. "You think he's going to come at you from inside," he said. "I think it's smarter than a frontal approach. And Bellows seems smart." Rhett was quiet. He turned toward the stove, and she thought he was going to go get coffee and leave it at that. But he stopped with his back still to her. "He's been after this property for 3 years," he said. "Not just the South 40, the whole thing. He wants the creek access and the South Meadow, and he's willing to wait." A pause. "I didn't tell you that before." "Why not?" He turned around. His face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was saying more than he usually said. "Because I didn't know what you were going to do when you got here. Whether you were going to stay or—" He stopped. "I didn't want to hand you someone else's problems before you decided if the problems were worth it." She looked at him for a moment. "They're my problems now," she said. "Whatever they are." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "I know that now." The stove ticked in the silence. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the grass. She could hear the horses in the barn, the gray quarter horse with her opinions about puddles shifting her weight, the sound of it carrying easily in the quiet night. "Get some sleep," Marigold said, "and keep that hand clean." He got his coffee and went. She sat with the new ledger open in front of her and looked at the first blank page. She wrote the date at the top, then the first entry, then the next. She was building something, line by line, entry by entry, delivery by delivery. It wasn't fast, it wasn't certain, but it was real, and it was hers, and she had learned a long time ago that real things built carefully were harder to knock down than people expected. 2 days later, the first payment came back short. Not by much. $4.30 on a payment that should have been $62. Easy to miss if you weren't checking. Easy to attribute to a simple accounting error if you didn't have a separate record to check against. She had the record. She also had Tom's delivery log signed by the receiving supervisor, documenting the full delivery at full weight and full count. She didn't go to Aldrich in a panic. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply brought both documents to his office the following morning and laid them on his desk side by side and let him look at them. He looked at them for a long time. "The receiving log is Marner's signature," he said. Marner was one of the camp supervisors. He wouldn't short pay. "I'm not saying he did," Marigold said carefully. "I'm saying the payment doesn't match the delivery record. I'd like to know where the discrepancy came from before it happens again." Aldrich looked at her. Then he looked at the documents. Then he picked up the receiving log and studied it with the particular attention of a man who was starting to understand what he was looking at. "Marner," he said slowly, "has been running with Bellows' seasonal men." She said nothing. She just let him get there on his own. He set the document down. "I'll make up the $4. "That's not why I brought it," she said. "I know it isn't." He looked at her. His expression had shifted to something she hadn't seen from him before, something that might have been respect, if you were generous, or at minimum the recognition that he was dealing with someone who wasn't going to be managed. "I'll look into it." She nodded. "Thank you." She gathered her documents and put them in her bag. At the door she stopped, not because she'd planned to, but because something occurred to her. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "whoever advised you on the original contract terms—" He waited. "They underestimated you," she said. "The contract I signed with you is fair. That reflects well on your judgment, not theirs." She wasn't entirely sure why she said it, but she thought it was true, and she thought it was useful for him to have heard it, and she thought there was a difference between flattery and accurate observation, and this was the latter. He was quiet for a moment. "Decker likes you," he said. "He doesn't like many people." "Decker is a good judge of delivery schedules," she said. "I'll take it." She walked out into the camp morning, where 400 men were eating bread and drinking hot coffee and going back to work, and she thought, hold the line, just keep holding the line. The wagon was where she'd left it. Tom had the team ready. She climbed up and they moved. Aldrich's investigation into the short payment took 4 days, which was 3 days longer than Marigold would have liked, but 1 day faster than she'd expected. When the answer came back, it came through Decker, who stopped her wagon at the East Gate on a Thursday morning and told her quietly that Marner had been let go. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. What she needed was to understand whether the problem was contained or whether it was the visible part of something larger. So she watched. She kept Tom logging every delivery with the same precision she'd established, kept the secondary ledger locked under her bed, kept her documentation clean and cross-referenced. Nothing else came back short. No other discrepancies appeared. After 2 more weeks, she allowed herself to conclude that Marner had been the mechanism and that without him, the immediate threat had collapsed. That didn't mean Bellows had given up. Men like Bellows didn't give up. They recalculated. But she'd bought time, and time was what she needed. The banknote was due in September. It was now the middle of July. She sat with the ledger on a Sunday afternoon while the ranch was quiet. Rhett out on the south pasture, Tom sleeping off a week of 4 a.m. starts, Pearl home with her children on her 1 day off. And she worked the numbers forward to September. The math was close. Closer than she wanted. The railroad contract payments were covering the monthly operating costs and chipping away at the deferred wages and building a small reserve. But small was the operative word. She needed 6 more weeks of clean payments to make the banknote without touching the equipment reserve. And if anything went wrong in those 6 weeks, a bad supply week, a wagon breakdown, a delivery disruption, she would have to choose between the note and the reserve, and either choice left something exposed. She put the pencil down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. It wasn't panic. She knew what panic felt like. It was fast and loud and made you stupid. This was something slower and heavier, the feeling of carrying a weight that wasn't going to get lighter for a while yet. She heard boots on the porch, and then the door. And Rhett came in from the pasture looking like a man who'd been in the sun for 4 hours, which he had. He went to the water basin and washed his face and hands and didn't say anything, but he looked at her on his way to get coffee, and he stopped. "What's wrong?" he said. "I'm running the September numbers." He poured his coffee and came to the table and sat down. She turned the ledger so he could see it. He looked at it for a while. 6 weeks, he said, give or take. And if something disrupts a payment, then we have a decision to make. She took her hands away from her eyes. I've been thinking about whether there's anything we can do on the ranch side to add margin. Not a lot. Something. He was quiet, looking at the ledger. The South Meadow Garden, he said. You've been supplying the camp partly from outside purchases. If the garden was producing at full scale, you could cut the outside supply cost by, he tilted his head, calculating, maybe 15% of the weekly food budget. I know, but getting it to full production takes time we don't have for September. Not September, he agreed, but the contract runs 18 months. 15% of supply costs over 18 months is real money. She looked at him. He was right, and she'd known he was right. But she'd been so focused on the immediate horizon that she hadn't let herself think past September. What would it take to get the South Meadow fully producing? She said. Work, he said. Irrigation from the creek needs clearing. There's a debris blockage I haven't dealt with because there wasn't a point. 2 weeks of labor, maybe 3. You and the hands? Me and Domingo and Tom. If you can spare them from the kitchen prep some afternoons. She thought about the kitchen schedule. It was tight, but not rigid. I can give you Tom 3 afternoons a week. Domingo I need in the mornings, but afternoons he's yours if he's willing. He's willing, Rhett said. I already asked him. She looked at him. You already asked him. Last week. He met her eyes. I've been running the same numbers you have. I just didn't say anything because I wasn't sure the irrigation work was viable until I walked it. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something different in the way he said it. Not defensive, not apologetic, just stating a fact. He'd been thinking about the same problem she had, working it from his side, the land side, while she worked it from the money side. It was the first time she'd clearly seen that they were, in fact, approaching this from the same direction. All right, she said, start Monday. He nodded and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the South Meadow, and she went back to the ledger, and they sat in a silence that was different from the silence on the wagon that first night. This one had something in it. Not warmth, not yet. That was too easy a word. Something more like two people recognizing that the space between them had changed shape. August came in hot and dry, the kind of heat that settled into the ground and stayed there even after the sun went down. The irrigation work opened up the south meadow by the third week, and while the vegetables wouldn't be producing at full scale until spring, Rhett got a late-season planting of greens in that were throwing usable leaves within 3 weeks. It wasn't 15% of supply costs, not yet, but it was something, and something was better than theory. The deliveries held. The payments came in clean. Tom's logs were immaculate. On a Monday in the second week of August, Pearl came in early and found Marigold at the table with a letter she'd received from a woman in Larimer County named Agnes Bright, who had heard through mutual acquaintance that there was a catering operation running out of Clearwater and wanted to discuss a potential arrangement for the mining camp startup in the fall. "Is that the Larimer operation?" Pearl said, reading the name on the envelope. "It is." Pearl sat down and poured herself coffee without asking, which was a thing she'd started doing about 3 weeks in and which Marigold had taken as a sign that something was working. "What does she want?" "A meeting." Marigold folded the letter. "She runs the supply logistics for the Larimer Company. She wants to know if I can handle their camp." "Can we?" Marigold looked at her. Pearl had said we, which also meant something. "Not in the fall," Marigold said honestly. "We're at capacity right now, but in the spring, if we had one more wagon and 2 more hands, we could run both operations simultaneously." 2 more hands, Pearl said. "Any candidates?" Marigold had been thinking about this. There were women in Clearwater in Pearl's situation, competent, underemployed, managing on the edges of what the town's economy made available to them. She'd been watching the way she watched everything, noting names and faces and what she knew about their circumstances. "There's a woman named Dora Vance," she said. "Her husband works the mine over in Elk Ridge, gone most of the month. She's been taking in washing, but she used to cook for a boarding house in Colorado. And there's a girl named Inez. She's maybe 20, she's Domingo's niece. She came up from Santa Fe in the spring, and she's been doing day labor at the Hedges store." Pearl considered both of them. "I know Dora, she's reliable. Inez, I don't know. Domingo vouches for her." "That's enough for me," Pearl said. Marigold wrote back to Agnes Bright that afternoon. She was honest about the timeline, spring, not fall, and honest about the capacity requirements. She proposed a preliminary meeting in September to discuss terms, with the understanding that nothing would be finalized until she'd assessed the logistics. She did not tell Aldrich about the letter, though she wasn't required to under the right of first refusal clause. The clause only applied when she was ready to commit, not when she was exploring. She filed that distinction carefully. The banknote came due on the 8th of September. She'd been tracking the date the way you track the weather when a storm is coming. Not obsessively, but with a constant background awareness that meant she was never surprised by the number of days remaining. She and Rhett drove to Cheyenne together to deal with it. It was the first time they'd gone anywhere together that wasn't ranch business in the immediate vicinity, and the 6-hour drive was different from that first 40 minutes from the station. Not easy. They were still not easy with each other, not in the uncomplicated way some people are, but there was a working familiarity between them now. She knew how he drank his coffee. He knew she thought better when she was moving. She knew he got quiet when he was worried rather than when he was dismissive. He knew she didn't need reassurance. She needed information. The bank office in Cheyenne was a solid stone building on the main commercial street, with a clerk behind a high wooden counter and a manager named Forsyth who came out to meet them when Rhett gave his name. Forsyth was the sort of man who expected certain things from a meeting about a past due note, and what he expected was an extension request. He had the paperwork ready. She could see it on his desk. Rhett slid the payment across the desk instead. Full amount. No extension request. Forsyth looked at the payment. He looked at Rhett. He looked at Marigold, who was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her expression professionally neutral. "In full," Forsyth said. "In full," Rhett said. Forsyth picked up the payment and verified it and made his notations and produced a receipt and a clear account statement, and the whole thing took less than 20 minutes. In the wagon afterward, heading back toward Clearwater, Rhett didn't say much for the first hour. She didn't push. She looked at the landscape, different from Wyoming around the ranch, flatter here, more traffic on the road, and thought about what came next. My father took that note out to buy breeding stock, Rhett said, out of nowhere. 3 years before he died, he thought he was going to turn the herd around. He was looking at the road. Then the winter hit. She waited. I've been carrying it since he died, he said. The note and everything else. I couldn't... He stopped. Something moved in his jaw, the muscle there tightening. I couldn't make it work and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. And after a while I stopped trying to figure it out and just started trying to get through the week. That's not a character flaw, she said. That's what happens when a weight gets heavy enough. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote to the service because I needed help, not company. I didn't know how to say that in a letter, so I just said what I said. He glanced at her sideways, about not being easy. You were accurate, she said. Something crossed his face. You could have turned around when you saw the place. I thought about it, she said honestly. That first night, he absorbed that. What made you stay? She thought about it. The numbers, she said. The situation was bad, but it wasn't impossible. And, she paused. You fed your horses before you came in for your own dinner. I saw that the first night when you didn't know I was watching from the kitchen window. Someone who does that when things are falling apart isn't giving up. They're just running out of road. He looked at her for a moment longer than was probably safe given that he was driving. Then he looked back at the road. They drove another mile in quiet. The service didn't send a description of you, he said. Just the letter. I didn't know what to expect. Was I what you expected? A pause. No. Better or worse? He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. Different, he said. I expected someone who needed something and was willing to work for it. I got someone who... He seemed to search for the words and not quite find the right ones. Someone who knew what they were doing before they got here. I just didn't know if they'd find anything worth doing. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her in 4 months. She sat with it. I found plenty worth doing, she said. He nodded. And that was all. But it was enough. The dining house came about almost accidentally, the way some of the better things did. Pearl had mentioned in passing that the lunch options in Clearwater for working people were poor. The hotel dining room was too expensive for day laborers and ranch hands, and there was a hash counter near the stockyards that did breakfast but closed at 10. If you were in town at noon, you either brought food or went without. Marigold filed that away. In October, when the railroad contract had stabilized and the Larimer negotiations were in early stages and the ranch accounts were running positive for the first time in years, she went to look at the empty building on Clearwater's main street that had been a dry goods store before the owner moved to Denver. It was dusty, and the floor needed work, and the back room smelled like it had been used to store something that had spoiled. But the bones were sound, and the kitchen space that the previous owner had built for stock processing could be converted. She talked to the building's owner, a man in Denver she reached by letter, and negotiated a lease. She didn't tell Rhett until the lease was signed, not because she was hiding it, but because she'd learned that he engaged better with realities than with proposals. Proposing things to Rhett sometimes got tied up in the part of him that had been managing disaster for 3 years and was still reflexively cautious. Showing him something already in motion worked better. When she told him, he was quiet for a long moment. A dining house, he said. Lunch service. Noon to 2. Simple menu, reasonable price. The working population of this town has nowhere to eat a midday meal. That's more operation than you're already running. Pearl manages the ranch kitchen largely independently at this point. I have Dora and Inez starting next month. The dining house is a separate thing, but it uses the same supply network and the same scheduling logic. He looked at her. You've already signed the lease. Yes. He was quiet again. She waited for the caution to surface, for the version of him that was still wary of overextension. Instead, he said, the floor in those old dry goods buildings is usually pine. It'll need sealing or you'll have splinters and everything. She blinked. Is that a yes? It's an observation about the floor, he said. But yes. She hired a carpenter from town named Walt, who was 60 and slow but meticulous, and he spent 2 weeks on the floor in the back room while she and Domingo worked out the kitchen setup. She sourced the equipment, a proper range, a prep table that didn't wobble, shelving, and paid for it out of the operating reserve, which was now substantial enough to take the hit without flinching. Dora Vance turned out to be exactly what Domingo had assessed: reliable, experienced, and efficient in the specific way of someone who'd cooked at scale before and knew how to manage waste. She took to the dining house kitchen immediately, with the ease of a person returning to something they'd been good at and missed. Ines was younger and less experienced, but she had Domingo's same quality of watching carefully before acting, and she learned fast. Within 3 weeks, she was managing the lunch prep independently while Dora handled the cooking. The dining house opened on a Wednesday in late October. It was not an elegant opening. The sign that Walt had made was slightly crooked, and she didn't have time to fix it before the doors opened at noon. The soup that day was too salty. Dora had miscalculated the reduction time for the stock, and they had to water it down and hope nobody complained too much. A few people complained. Not many. By the second week, the noon crowd was filling the 12 tables they had, and some people were standing. By the fourth week, Pearl mentioned that she'd heard 2 women talking at the general store about the dining house, and what they'd said was that it was the kind of place where you didn't feel embarrassed to eat alone, which Marigold thought was one of the better compliments a public eating establishment could receive. It was in November that Rhett told her about his family. She hadn't asked. She'd known since early on that there was something. The quality of the silence in the house had told her, the rooms upstairs that were clearly not used, the way he looked sometimes at nothing in particular with an expression that was less about the present moment than about something else entirely. She'd waited. She'd learned that with Rhett, you waited. It was a cold night in the second week of November, the first real cold snap of the season, and she'd kept the kitchen stove burning late because the chill was coming through the walls in a way that made her think about the repairs they still needed to get to before winter properly settled in. Rhett came in late and sat down, and she poured him coffee and sat across from him because she could see from his face that this was one of those evenings where the thing that needed saying was close to the surface. She waited. "I had a wife before," he said, "and a son." She kept her expression still. "I know you've had loss," she said carefully. "You didn't have to tell me more than that." "I know I didn't." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Her name was Clara. The boy was Daniel. He was 4. He stopped. "Fever, the winter of '78. Clara first and then Daniel 10 days later. I was out trying to save a section of the herd in the storm, and I wasn't—" His jaw worked. "I wasn't here." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would improve on silence. "After that, He shook his head. "I kept the ranch going because I didn't know what else to do. And then it stopped going, and by the time you came, I think I was mostly just waiting for the whole thing to finish." He looked up at her. "That's an ugly thing to tell someone." "It's an honest thing," she said. "You came here to build something," he said. "And I wasn't. I had nothing to offer that. I just had—" He gestured vaguely at the walls, meaning the ranch, the land, the broken fences, and the peeling paint, and all of it. "This." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you know why I stayed past the first night?" "You said the numbers." "That was part of it." She paused, choosing the words carefully. "The other part was that this place needed something done to it, and I needed a place where I could do something. That's not noble, it's just mutual. You had a problem that matched what I know how to do. I needed to matter somewhere." She held his gaze. "We made an arrangement and it turned into something that I didn't anticipate. I think you didn't either." He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. "No," he said. "I didn't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, just briefly, just long enough to mean something. Then she took it back. "Clara and Daniel are why you feed the horses first," she said. He looked at her. "Because you didn't get back in time," she said. "So you make sure you get back. And while you're here, you take care of what's here, even when it's hard. Even when you think there's no point." She watched his face. That's not someone who'd given up. That was someone still doing the right thing by habit because they couldn't remember how to stop. He didn't speak. Something moved in his eyes that she didn't try to name. "We should look at the east wall before hard winter," she said. "There's a gap in the chinking near the second window that's going to be a problem by January." He exhaled. A long, slow breath. "I saw it," he said. "I'll get to it this week." "Good." She got up and rinsed her cup and set it to dry. At the door, she stopped. "Rhett," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without thinking about it first. He looked at her. "We're not just getting through anymore," she said. "I want you to know that." He held her gaze, and in the lamplight his face was open in a way she hadn't seen before. Not unguarded exactly, but less armored, like a window with the shutter pulled back. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm starting to see that." She went upstairs. She lay on the mattress that still had opinions and looked at the Wyoming stars through the window she'd stuffed a rag around and thought about the shape of the thing they were building. It wasn't what she'd expected when she stepped off that train. It was harder than she'd expected, and stranger, and more complicated. But it was real, and it was growing, and those were the two things that mattered most to her. In the morning, she'd drive the delivery and check the dining house accounts and write back to Agnes Bright about the spring Larimer timeline. There was always something to do next. There always would be. But for the first time since she'd arrived in Clearwater County, she didn't fall asleep running numbers. She fell asleep thinking about the east wall and the south meadow, and the sound of Rhett's voice saying, "Yeah," in the lamplight, like a man remembering how to mean something. Outside, the first real snow of winter was starting to come down, soft and quiet, covering the ranch in something that looked almost like a fresh start. The letter from Agnes Bright arrived on a Thursday in early March, and it was not the letter Marigold had been expecting. She'd been anticipating the final contract terms for the Larimer mining operation. They'd been going back and forth since September, slowly closing the gap between what Agnes's company wanted to pay and what Marigold needed to make the operation viable. They'd been close for 2 weeks. She'd expected a yes or a final counter. What she got instead was a different proposition entirely. She read it at the kitchen table while the morning prep was running behind her, Dora moving through the ranch kitchen with the efficiency she'd developed over 4 months, Inez sorting the supply delivery at the back table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the south meadow, where the snow was pulling back from the edges, and the first suggestion of green was starting to show in the places where the irrigation clearing had improved drainage. Agnes Bright was not writing about the Larimer contract. She was writing about her employer. The regional supply company that Agnes worked for, Bright and Halverson Frontier Supply, out of Cheyenne, was being sold. The owner, a man named Halverson, who'd built the company over 20 years and had no children, and whose partner Bright had died in 1881, wanted out. He was 63 and tired and had received a land offer in California that he intended to take. He was selling the company as a going concern. 7 wagons, established contracts with 4 mining operations, and 2 railroad camps across Wyoming and southern Colorado, a warehouse in Cheyenne, and a staff of 11. Agnes Bright had been trying to put together a buying consortium for 6 months. She had 2 investors. She needed a third, and she needed someone who could run the operational side because she was logistics, not kitchen management, and the company's value was in its food service contracts. She had heard, through the network of people who talk about things in small frontier territories, about what was happening out of Clearwater County, about the railroad contract and the dining house and the women who'd been hired and the ranch that had come back from the edge. She was asking if Marigold wanted to talk. Marigold sat with his letter for a long time. Long enough that Dora asked twice if she wanted her coffee warmed, and long enough that Inez finished the supply sort and started on the morning bread without being asked. Then she folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and went to find Rhett. He was in the barn, which was where he was most mornings now. They'd started a slow repair of the structure in January, replacing the worst of the boards, reinforcing the loft floor, and the work was going at the pace that real repair work goes, which is slower than you want but more permanent than a quick fix. He was up on a ladder when she came in, and he looked down at her face and came down the ladder. She gave him the letter. He read it standing there in the barn with sawdust on his shirt and a nail between his teeth, and she watched him the way she'd gotten practiced at watching him, not for the surface expression but for the small things underneath it. She saw him slow down on the second paragraph. She saw him go back to the beginning and read it again. He took the nail out of his teeth. "Bright and Halverson," he said. "I know that company. They supply the Elk Ridge mine. They've been operating 15 years at least. 20, according to Agnes. And Halverson wants to sell the whole thing. For the right price," she said. Agnes didn't put a number in the letter. She wants to meet first. He handed the letter back. "What do you think the right price is?" "I don't know yet. I'd need to see the books. All of them. The contracts, the equipment valuations, the warehouse lease, the staff costs. She folded the letter. It's too big for me to do alone. That's why Agnes is building a consortium. How much would your share be? Depends on the total price and how it's divided. She paused. It would be more than we have liquid, but not more than we could raise against the ranch and the existing contracts as collateral. Rhett was quiet. She watched him think. He had a particular stillness when he was thinking seriously about something, not the old closed-off silence of a man who'd stopped engaging with the future, but a focused quiet, the kind that meant he was actually working the problem. If it goes wrong, he said, we'd be leveraged against the ranch. Yes. And if it goes right, we'd have 7 wagons and contracts across 2 territories and a warehouse in Cheyenne, and we'd be the largest independent food service operation on the Wyoming frontier. He looked at her for a long moment. You've already decided, he said. She opened her mouth to say she hadn't, and then closed it again, because he was right, and she'd learned not to waste words lying to him about things he could see clearly. I want to meet with Agnes before I decide, she said. But yes, I think this is what the last 8 months have been building toward. Not this specifically. I didn't know this was coming. But this kind of thing, the next scale. The next scale, he repeated. He looked at the barn wall, at the new boards beside the old ones, at the work still left to do. You know what I thought when you first told me about the railroad camp idea? When you showed me those numbers at the kitchen table that first week? What? I thought you were going to be gone in a month. He said it without bitterness. I thought you'd figure out the situation was too bad and get on the eastbound train, and I couldn't blame you. I thought the numbers were something you were doing to feel useful while you decided. She said nothing. I was wrong, he said simply. I've been wrong about a lot of things, but that one cost me about 6 weeks of actually helping when I could have been. He looked at her. I'm not going to do that again. If you want to meet with Agnes Bright, we meet with Agnes Bright. And if the numbers make sense, we find a way to make it work. She looked at him. In the dusty barn light, with sawdust on his shirt and a ladder behind him and the new boards half finished on the wall, he looked like a man who'd come back from somewhere far away and was still getting his bearings, but was no longer lost. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until you've seen Halverson's books. Then decide if there's anything to thank me for. They went to Cheyenne in April, which was not ideal timing because April in Wyoming is the month that can't make up its mind about being winter or spring and usually compromises by being both on the same day. The road was mud for the first 40 miles, and Rhett drove while Marigold went over her prepared questions for Agnes Bright, and they made it to Cheyenne in 6 hours, only slightly worse for wear. Agnes Bright turned out to be a compact woman of 45 with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that Marigold associated with people who had been underestimated enough times to stop softening their manner for other people's comfort. They recognized something in each other immediately, the way people do who've been operating in spaces that weren't designed for them and have developed the same particular set of adaptations. They met in a hotel dining room, the 4 of them, Marigold and Rhett, Agnes and the 2 investors she'd already secured, a cattle buyer named Morrison, and a woman named Hale who owned a dry goods import business in Laramie. The books were on the table within the first 20 minutes. Agnes was efficient that way. Marigold went through them the way she went through every set of numbers, not fast, not performing confidence, just reading carefully and writing notes on her own paper. She asked questions when she had them. Agnes answered directly. Morrison asked questions about the wagon valuations, and Hale asked about the warehouse lease terms, and Rhett asked about the Elk Ridge contract renewal date, which was a question nobody else had thought to ask, and which turned out to matter because the contract was up in 8 months and hadn't been renegotiated. That's a risk, Rhett said, not accusingly. It's leverage if the renewal goes well, Agnes said, and a liability if it doesn't. What's the relationship with Elk Ridge? Marigold asked. Stable. They've renewed twice, but the new mine manager came in January, and I haven't read him yet. Marigold made a note. I'll want to meet him before we finalize anything. Agnes looked at her. You're already planning for post-acquisition. I'm planning for whether there should be one, Marigold said. Those aren't the same thing until they are. Morrison smiled at that, which told her something useful about him. They talked for 3 hours. By the end, Marigold had a number in her head, what she thought the company was worth, Not what Halverson was asking, which was higher, but what it was worth in the honest calculation that accounted for the Elk Ridge uncertainty and the deferred equipment maintenance she'd spotted in the capital expenditure records. She and Rhett talked that night in their hotel room, which was the first time they'd shared a room and which would have felt stranger than it did, except that they were both too focused on the numbers to pay much attention to anything else. She laid out her assessment. He listened. He had 2 corrections. One she accepted, one she argued, and he conceded after she explained her reasoning. "The number you're thinking," he said, "it's lower than what Halverson's asking. By 12%. He won't take that." "He might," she said, "if we structure the difference as a deferred payment contingent on the Elk Ridge renewal. He gets his full price if the contract renews. He takes our lower price if it doesn't." She paused. "It protects us on the risk, and it gives him upside on the outcome. If he believes in the company, he takes it." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "And if he doesn't believe in it? Then we learn something important before we buy it." He looked at her across the narrow hotel room with its questionable wallpaper and its window that let in street noise from below. There was something in his expression that she'd learned to recognize over the past months. Not admiration exactly, more like the look of someone watching a thing work properly and appreciating the mechanics of it. "All right," he said. "Make the offer." Halverson took 4 days to respond. She spent those 4 days back at the ranch, running her regular operation, not thinking about Cheyenne more than she could help. The deliveries went out. The dining house ran its lunch service. Dora had started offering a Friday special, a rotating dish that she changed each week, and it had become the thing the regular customers talked about, which was exactly the kind of loyalty driver Marigold had hoped for when she'd given Dora the latitude to experiment. The response came by telegram. Halverson accepted the structure. Not without negotiation, he'd pushed back on the deferred payment timeline, wanting a shorter contingency window, and she'd given him 2 months off the original term. But the fundamental deal held. She was standing at the kitchen table when Rhett came in from the pasture, and she handed him the telegram without saying anything and watched him read it. He set it down on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should tell Domingo." She laughed. It came out before she could hold it. A real laugh, sudden and slightly surprised, and it was a measure of how much had changed that she could laugh like that in this kitchen that had smelled of disuse when she arrived, and now smelled of bread and coffee, and something that was starting to feel like home. "Yes," she said, "we should tell Domingo." The acquisition closed in June, almost exactly 1 year after Marigold Quinn had stepped off a train at Clearwater Station with a canvas bag and a cast-iron skillet and $42 in her coat pocket. The closing was handled in Cheyenne with Agnes present and a lawyer who charged too much but was worth it. And when it was done, Bright and Halverson Frontier Supply became, after some discussion of names, the Callaway Bright Frontier Catering Company, which Agnes had lobbied for on the grounds that the Callaway name was known in the territory now in a way that had commercial value. Marigold had looked at Rhett when Agnes proposed it. He'd shrugged. "It's your operation," he said. "It's ours," she said. "Then put both names on it," he said. "That's how it should be." It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nothing was resolved or transformed in a single sentence. But she noticed that he'd said "that's how it should be" rather than "if you want" or "it's up to you," and she filed that away as another small sign of the same man who'd asked good questions about the Elk Ridge contract in that hotel dining room. The man who'd been there all along, just buried under enough grief and exhaustion that it had taken some digging to find him. The Elk Ridge contract renewed. The new mine manager had turned out to be a practical man who cared about one thing, whether his workers were functioning. And when Marigold met with him in May and laid out what the Clearwater Railroad camp numbers had looked like after she'd taken over the food service, he'd been persuaded without much resistance. Productivity numbers speak a language that practical men understand. With the company's 7 wagons and Clearwater's 2, the operation now ran 9 delivery routes across 3 counties. She kept Domingo at the Clearwater operation, which was the right decision because the Clearwater Railroad camp was his territory in the way that matters. He knew every face, knew the rhythms, knew how to handle Decker, and how to read when the crew was running high tension and needed something extra on the meal to smooth it out. She brought in a man from Cheyenne named Harlan to run the warehouse logistics, because Agnes knew him and Agnes's judgment on operational people had proven sound. Pearl ran the dining house independently now, which had been an evolution rather than a decision. Over the winter, Pearl had gradually taken on more of the management, the supply ordering, the staff scheduling, the daily accounts, until one day in February, Marigold had realized that she hadn't needed to weigh in on the dining house's operations in 3 weeks, and everything was running better than when she'd been more involved. She'd given Pearl the title and a corresponding wage adjustment, and Pearl had said, "It's about time," and gone back to her accounts. Dora and Inez were both still there. Inez had turned out to have a specific talent for training new hires, patient, clear, with a memory for the specific mistakes beginners make that allowed her to preempt them. When they brought on 2 more women for the expanded operation in the fall, Inez ran the onboarding without being asked. Marigold thought about that sometimes. The way a place made room for what people were actually capable of, if you let it. The town gathering happened on a Saturday evening in late September. It had been organized by the Clearwater Merchants Association, which was a loose and sometimes contentious body that met above the hardware store and argued about road maintenance and whether the stockyard should be moved further from the main street. They'd been organizing a harvest dinner for years, and this year they'd asked to hold it at the Callaway Dining House, which had been expanded in August to 20 tables when the original 12 proved insufficient for the Friday specials demand. Marigold hadn't planned to say anything. She'd planned to be there and make sure the food was right and stay out of the speeches, which were going to be delivered by Hedges and the mayor and whoever else wanted the floor. But after Hedges spoke and the mayor spoke, there was a pause, and someone in the room, she never found out who, said Callaway, and then other people said it, and then it became the kind of situation where she was either going to stand up or make things awkward for everyone by not standing up. She stood up. The room was full. Not just merchants, working people, ranch hands, women who'd come into town for the evening, a few of the railroad camp crew who'd made the trip. She recognized Decker near the back, which surprised her. She hadn't expected him. She hadn't prepared anything, which was probably why what she said was more honest than it might have been. "I came here 14 months ago on a train," she said. "I didn't know this place. I didn't know any of you. I had some money and a skillet and a plan that was mostly arithmetic and optimism and not much else." She looked around the room. The plan worked, but that's not the interesting thing. Plans are just numbers until people make them real. Domingo made it real. Pearl made it real. Dora and Inez and Tom made it real. Every person in this room who ate at this table and told someone else about it made it real. She stopped for a moment. She hadn't meant to look at Rhett, but she did. He was standing near the side wall with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was in a room, and not sure what to do with himself socially. And he was looking at her with the open expression she'd first seen in the lamplight of the kitchen that November night, when he'd told her about Clara and Daniel. Not the closed, armored thing he'd been when she arrived. The other thing. The underneath thing. "I want to say one more thing," she said, and she was still looking at him when she said it. "There's a version of this story where I came here and fixed a problem, and that's the whole story. The problem was real, and fixing it was real. But the part that I didn't expect, the part that isn't in any plan I wrote down, is that a place can change you if you let it, and the people in it can change you. And sometimes what you think you came to do and what you actually end up doing are not the same thing, and the second thing is better." She sat down. The room made the noise rooms make when something has landed, a collective shift and exhale. Rhett was still looking at her. Later, after the dinner and the talking and the slow dispersal of people into the cooling September night, they walked out together to where their wagon was hitched on the side street. The town was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes after a lot of noise has been made, and the noise has been good. She untied the horse, and he took the reins, and they stood there for a moment in the dark. "That was well said," he told her. "I meant it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "The part about the second thing being better." "Yes," she said. He was looking at the horse, not at her, which she'd learned was sometimes how he said the things that were hardest to say. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know I'm not a man who says things the way some men say things. I know there are parts of this that I haven't—" He stopped, tried again. "What you built here, what you made out of what I had and couldn't hold together. I want you to know that I see it. Not just the company or the contracts or the money. I see what it cost you. The 4 a.m. starts and the contract fights and the bellows business and all of it. I see it, and I want you to know I'm not going to be the kind of man who takes that for granted." She looked at him in the dark street. He was still looking at the horse, jaw set in the way it got when he was pushing through discomfort to say something because the saying of it mattered. "You're already not that man," she said. "You haven't been for a while." He finally looked at her. "I'm working on it," he said. "I wanted you to know that I know I'm working on it." She reached over and took his hand, not briefly this time, the way she'd done in November. She just held it. He held hers back. They stood like that in the quiet street for a moment, the horse patient beside them, the lights of the dining house still warm in the windows behind them, the Wyoming stars starting to come out overhead in their excessive, crowded way. "Let's go home," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." The ranch ledger balanced for the first time in 4 years at the end of September. She noted it without ceremony, put a line through the final column, recorded the positive number, closed the book. Rhett was sitting across the table from her, and she showed it to him, and he looked at it for a long moment, and then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was true and didn't need words around it. The east fence was repaired. All of it, not just the section near the gate. All 600 yards, new posts and new rails, standing straight in the ground the way fences are supposed to stand. The barn roof had been redone in August. The porch railing was back up and level. The crack in the upstairs window had been reglazed rather than held together with cloth. The ranch hands who'd been working on deferred wages were caught up. Tom had gotten a raise that she'd told him was overdue, and he'd argued it wasn't necessary, and she'd given it to him anyway. Domingo had been offered a share of the catering company's profits. A small share, a number they could sustain, but real. And he'd accepted it with the same economy of expression he brought to everything, just a nod, and "I'll earn it." "You already have," she'd said. "Then I'll keep earning it," he'd said. There was still work to do on the ranch itself. The cattle operation was rebuilding slowly. The herd was up 40% from where it had been when she arrived, but it was still a fraction of what the land could support. That was a 5-year project at minimum, the steady accumulation of breeding stock and grazing rotation management and patience. Rhett was good at the patience when he wasn't drowning in despair, and he wasn't drowning anymore. The dining house was profitable. The catering company was growing. The South Meadow was producing at the rate Rhett had calculated, and the supply cost reduction was real and compounding. Agnes Bright ran the Cheyenne operation with a directness that Marigold trusted completely and occasionally challenged on principle, because Agnes respected people who pushed back and tended to dismiss people who didn't. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was. Decker had a falling out with one of her drivers in October over a delivery route disagreement that took 2 weeks to resolve and cost her one uncomfortable conversation with Aldrich, which she had and survived. Inez's mother came up from Santa Fe in November, and Inez asked for 2 weeks off, and Marigold gave it to her, and the kitchen ran badly for 4 days before adjusting, and she filed that away as a lesson about single points of failure and started cross-training everybody on the roles they didn't usually cover. Pearl's husband never came back from Denver. Pearl had known for a while that he wasn't going to, and she didn't talk about it much. But one evening she said to Marigold that she'd been saving enough to buy the building that the dining house was leasing, and was that something Marigold would consider? And Marigold said yes immediately, and they worked out terms that same afternoon. Pearl became the building's co-owner in December. "My mother told me a woman should never own property," Pearl said when the papers were signed. "What do you think?" Marigold said. Pearl looked at the papers. "I think my mother hadn't tried it." Marigold took that home with her and thought about it for a long time, not because it was surprising, but because it kept being true in new ways. The things people told you were impossible had a way of revealing themselves as merely difficult if you kept working in their direction without stopping to ask permission. She hadn't asked permission when she'd come to Wyoming. She hadn't asked permission to turn a struggling ranch kitchen into a catering operation, or to negotiate a railroad contract, or to spot a trap in a clause and counter it, or to buy a failing company and build something from it. She'd assessed what was real, what was possible, and what it would cost. And then she'd done the work. That wasn't exceptional. It was just what work looked like when you took it seriously. On a cold morning in December, her second Wyoming winter now, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Rhett come out of the barn with 2 of the horses and walk them to the water trough. He moved differently than he had a year ago. The same man, the same measured pace, but something in the set of his shoulders was different. Less like a man carrying something he was about to drop. More like a man who knew where he was going and had decided it was worth going there. He looked up and saw her at the window. He raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, more of an acknowledgement, the way people who have been in each other's company long enough acknowledge each other across distance. She raised hers back. She thought about what she would say if she were trying to explain any of this to the woman who'd stepped off the train at Clearwater Station 14 months ago. The woman with the skillet and the arithmetic and the stubborn conviction that broken things were mostly just things that hadn't been fixed yet. She'd say, "You were right about the numbers, and you were wrong about what mattered most. The numbers were necessary. The numbers were always necessary. You couldn't build anything real without knowing what it cost and what it was worth, and where the margin was, and when to hold and when to move." She would never apologize for being the kind of person who counted carefully, but the numbers weren't the thing. The thing was Domingo holding one end of a measuring string in a wagon bed at dusk without asking why. It was Tom logging delivery receipts with meticulous handwriting nobody had asked him to develop. It was Pearl making bread that held heat for 4 hours because her mother had made it for harvest crews, and she'd carried that knowledge all her life waiting for somewhere to put it. It was Rhett coming down a ladder to read a letter and asking the right question about a contract renewal date. It was all the ordinary human effort of people who showed up and kept showing up even when they were tired and even when things went wrong and even when the outcome wasn't certain. That was the thing that couldn't be put in a ledger, and it was the thing that made every ledger work. She finished her coffee, she rinsed the cup and set it to dry. She put on her coat and her boots, and she went out into the Wyoming morning to start the day's work. The snow had been and gone, and the ground was hard, and the sky was the particular clear, cold blue of December in that country, wide and honest, and going on longer than you'd think anything could go. The mountains were sharp against it to the west, the same mountains she'd seen on that first evening from the wagon seat, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. She'd stopped finding the landscape lonely somewhere around her 3rd month. Now it just felt like where she was. Like the place that had made room for her the way places do when you stay long enough to stop being a stranger. Rhett came around from the water trough. He fell into step beside her naturally, the way people do when they've been moving through the same spaces long enough that their rhythms have adjusted to each other without either of them deciding to make it happen. "Delivery crew's ready," he said. "Good." She glanced at him. "The south fence post by the creek said, Tom said one of the new rails is already sitting wrong. I'll look at it this afternoon." I told him the same thing and he said he already tried. Rhett made a sound. "Then I'll look at it after Tom's tried again." She smiled. She didn't do that as reflexively as some people, didn't put a smile on her face as a social habit, and she'd noticed that this made the time she actually did it carry more weight than they might have otherwise. He caught it. Something eased in his expression. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. They walked to the wagon. The morning delivery waited. The dining house would open at noon. The Cheyenne warehouse had a Tuesday dispatch. Agnes had sent a note about a potential 5th contract, and she needed to read it carefully because the terms were going to require negotiation. Always something next. Always another problem that was also an opportunity if you looked at it right. If you brought the right tools. If you showed up and kept showing up. She climbed up to the wagon seat and picked up the reins. Wyoming stretched out ahead of her, cold and open and full of work. She went.